All right, today we're going to try and make sense of three of the biggest, most tangled issues in American politics: the national debt, the deficit that keeps feeding it, and the government shutdowns that happen when the whole system just grinds to a halt.
It all kicks off with this just an insane number. $38 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt right now, and it just blew past another staggering milestone.
But you know, a number that big, it's so huge it kind of feels fake, right? So let's bring it back down to earth. What does this mountain of debt actually mean for the country? And more importantly, for you?
To really get what's going on, you have to appreciate not just the size of this problem, but how fast it's moving.
See, it's not just a big number sitting there. It's accelerating. The government tacked on the last $1 trillion in just 2.5 months. Think about that. This isn't some slow drip. This is a fire hose of debt.
So, where is all this debt even coming from? Well, the short answer is the deficit. Let's break down exactly how that works. Okay, first, a quick but important piece of housekeeping. The government doesn't work on a normal January to December calendar. They use what's called a fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. So all the numbers we're talking about are based on that schedule. And this is the heart of the problem. In the last fiscal year, the U.S. government spent almost $1.8 trillion more than it brought in. That gap, that's the annual deficit. And every single year, that amount gets piled right on top of the national debt.
All right, let's follow the money. First, where does it all come from? Well, about half of all federal money, we're talking over $2.6 trillion, comes straight from our paychecks, from personal income taxes. The rest comes from things like Social Security and Medicare taxes, corporate taxes, stuff like that.
And then, poof, here's where it all goes. The biggest chunks are probably what you'd guess: Social Security and healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid. But see that third slice there? Interest on the debt? That's a huge one, and we're definitely coming back to it.
So when you boil it all down, it's just some simple but kind of devastating math. The government brought in over $5 trillion, but it spent over $7 trillion. That gap is the deficit. It's the money they have to borrow every year, just adding to that giant mountain of debt.
And this right here is where a simple math problem turns into a complete political nightmare. Because, if the problem is just spending too much, the solution seems pretty obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah, why not just cut spending, balance the budget? Well, it turns out it's nowhere near that simple. Once you look at where the money is actually going, the choices become, well, pretty much impossible.
Check this out. This is one of the biggest hurdles. Last year, the U.S. government spent $970 billion just on interest payments for the debt it already has. That's more than the entire budget for national defense. Just let that sink in for a second. Paying the interest on past borrowing now costs more than the entire U.S. military.
Okay, so if we have to make some massive cuts, where do you even start? Well, the biggest single line item is Social Security at about $1.5 trillion a year. So could we just cut there? The short answer? No way! Politically, it's a non-starter. And the reason is simple. 72 million Americans get Social Security benefits. Any politician who even hints at cutting that is basically committing career suicide. Those 72 million people, they vote. Okay, fine. What about that other massive expense, the interest payments? Can we just decide not to pay them and save ourselves almost $1 trillion a year?
Nope, absolutely not. If the government just stops paying its interest, that's called a default, and the fallout would be nothing short of catastrophic. We're talking the U.S. dollar crashing, a global financial meltdown, and the U.S. losing its status as the world's bedrock economy like overnight.
So what happens when you have a gigantic spending problem with zero politically easy solutions? You get gridlock, total paralysis. And that gridlock leads to something very specific and very painful: a government shutdown.
And this is literally what that political dysfunction looks like. Not long ago, with a shutdown breathing down their necks, the Senate voted on the exact same funding bill 13 times in a row. It failed every single time, with the exact same vote count. That is the textbook definition of gridlock.
And look, this isn't just some political drama playing out in D.C. When the system grinds to a halt like this, the consequences get very real, for very real people, very, very fast.
Maybe the most immediate and widespread impact is on SNAP benefits, what we used to call food stamps. We're talking about 42 million Americans. That's 12% of the entire U.S. population who rely on this program. And during a shutdown, that money is just not guaranteed.
You might be thinking, well, can't they just use some emergency funds Turns out, no. This USDA memo explains that those funds were legally walled off for actual disasters. Think hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. They're not for predictable political failures. So the bureaucracy itself is a roadblock.
And the damage just ripples out from there. You've got TSA agents and air traffic controllers working without pay, and by law they can't even strike. The Federal Reserve suddenly can't get the economic data it needs to make decisions on interest rates. The owner of a small coffee shop next to a federal building watches his business dry up overnight. The Congressional Budget Office figured a recent shutdown cost the economy something like $18 billion in lost productivity. It touches everything.
You know, it's really easy to point fingers and blame one politician or one party for all this. But if you look at the data, this is a bipartisan problem through and through. President Bush added a record amount of debt. Then President Obama added more. President Trump added more than him. And now President Biden has added more than Trump. The pattern is crystal clear, no matter who's in the White House.
And that leaves us with one final, really critical question. If the spending just keeps going up, the debt keeps getting bigger and bigger, and our political system seems completely incapable of fixing it, who's actually on the hook for this $38 trillion bill? Who is the one that ultimately pays the price?